Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses as she leaned closer to the computer monitor in the basement archives of the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across rows of filing cabinets and digitization equipment. Outside, March rain drummed against the small windows near the ceiling, creating a rhythmic backdrop to her work. It was 2019, a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of March, and Sarah had spent the last 3 months cataloging photographs from the late 1800s, a project that had become both tedious and fascinating in equal measure. The basement archive was a labyrinth of Kentucky history. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with boxes containing everything from Civil War correspondence to early 20th century business records. The air smelled of old paper, preservation chemicals, and the faint mustiness that no amount of climate control could completely eliminate. Sarah had grown to love this smell, associating it with discovery and the thrill of connecting with the past. She had been working alone that afternoon. Her usual assistant, a graduate student named Lisa, had called in sick with the flu that was making its rounds through Frankfurt that winter. The solitude suited Sarah's methodical approach to digitization. Each photograph required careful handling, high-resolution scanning, detailed metadata entry, and cross-referencing with other historical documents. It was painstaking work, but Sarah had always believed that history lived in the details, in the small fragments that others might overlook. The photograph on her screen showed a typical Victorian family portrait from 1890. Taken in front of a 2-story farmhouse in rural Harlan County, Kentucky, the image depicted what appeared to be a prosperous family. A stern-faced man in his 50s stood at the center, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman who must have been his wife. He had the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, with deep lines around his eyes and a posture that spoke of both pride and burden. The woman beside him wore a dark dress with a high collar, her face composed but revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. 4 children of varying ages stood around them, dressed in their Sunday best. The oldest appeared to be in his 20s, standing rigid and formal beside his father. 2 daughters flanked their mother, both wearing identical expressions of practiced stillness. A younger boy stood slightly apart, perhaps 16 or 17, his hands clasped in front of him. The house behind them was modest but well-maintained, with white clapboard siding and dark shutters framing the windows. A small porch ran across the front, and Sarah could make out details like a rocking chair and what appeared to be farming tools leaning against the wall. The yard was bare dirt, typical of rural farmhouses of the era, with a split-rail fence visible at the edge of the frame. Sarah had seen hundreds of similar photographs over the past 3 months. Victorian family portraits followed a formula. Formal poses, serious expressions, the best clothes the family owned, a backdrop that demonstrated their prosperity and respectability. These photographs were expensive undertakings in the 1890s. A traveling photographer would have come through Harlan County, set up his equipment, and charged a significant fee for the service. Families saved for months to afford such a portrait. What made Sarah pause this time was something in the upper window, a detail so small she almost missed it. She had been about to move on to the next photograph when a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Not real movement, of course, but the way her eye had processed a pattern in the image that didn't quite fit with the rest. She zoomed in, using the high-resolution scan to examine the second-floor window more closely. Her breath caught in her throat. There, barely visible through the wavy glass typical of 19th-century windows, were 2 pale faces. 2 young women, or perhaps older girls, staring down at the camera. Their features were indistinct, blurred by the glass and the distance, but there was no mistaking the human forms. And there was something else, something that made Sarah's stomach tighten with unease. What appeared to be a chain or restraint, visible just at the edge of the window frame, catching the light in a way that made it stand out against the darker interior of the room. Sarah sat back in her chair, her heart racing. In 3 months of cataloging Victorian photographs, she had never seen anything like this. Families posed for portraits to project an image of respectability and normalcy. They didn't include disturbing details like faces in windows or visible restraints. The very presence of these elements suggested either a terrible oversight or, more chillingly, Something so normalized in the household that no one thought to remove the women from the window before the photograph was taken. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Marcus Chin answered on the third ring, his voice slightly out of breath. "Sarah? What's up?" "I'm just finishing a campus tour with prospective graduate students." "Marcus, I need you to come to the archives. I found something in one of the Harlan County photographs. Something disturbing." "Disturbing how?" Marcus's tone shifted immediately from casual to professional concern. "I can't explain over the phone. You need to see this. How soon can you get here?" "Give me 20 minutes. 23 minutes later, Marcus Chin pushed through the archive door, shaking rain from his jacket. He was in his early 40s, with graying temples and the permanently thoughtful expression of someone who spent too much time piecing together fragments of the past. Marcus had been at the University of Kentucky for 15 years, specializing in 19th century Appalachian history, with a particular focus on social structures and family dynamics in isolated rural communities. He and Sarah had collaborated on several projects over the years, and she trusted his analytical mind and his ability to see patterns that others missed. "Okay," Marcus said, pulling up a chair beside Sarah's workstation. "Show me what you found." Sarah pulled up the photograph, zoomed out to show the full family portrait. "First, tell me what you see. Just your initial impression." Marcus studied the image for a moment. Typical Victorian family portrait. Rural Kentucky, based on the architecture and landscape. Prosperous farmers, judging by their clothing and the condition of the house. Everyone's dressed formally, which means this was a special occasion. The father has his hand on the wife's shoulder, establishing his authority. Everything looks normal for 1890. Now look at the upper right window. Second floor. Sarah zoomed in slowly, letting Marcus's eyes adjust to the change in scale. She watched his face as he processed what he was seeing. His expression shifted from casual interest to confusion, then to something darker as the implications became clear. "Oh my God," Marcus said quietly. "Are those people? In the window?" "Two women. And look at this." Sarah enhanced the image further, adjusting the contrast and brightness. The faces became clearer, still indistinct but unmistakably human. Young women, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s, with hollow eyes and unkempt hair. One had long dark hair that hung lankly around her face. The other's hair was lighter, pulled back in a way that revealed the gaunt lines of her cheekbones. Both stared directly at the camera with expressions that haunted Sarah the more she looked at them. Not anger, not defiance, but something worse, resignation. The look of people who had stopped hoping for rescue. And the chain was unmistakable now, attached to something out of frame, probably to the wall or to restraints on the women themselves. The metal caught the light from the window, creating a bright line against the darkness of the interior. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face pale. This photograph was taken deliberately. The photographer would have taken several minutes to set up his equipment, compose the shot, prepare the plate. The family would have been standing there in position for at least that long, probably longer. And during all that time, those women were at the window, and no one moved them, no one closed a curtain, no one acknowledged their presence. "That's what disturbs me most," Sarah said. "It's not that they're there. It's that no one seemed to care that they would be in the photograph." The rain continued to fall outside, heavier now, with thunder rumbling in the distance. The basement archive felt suddenly oppressive, the weight of the past pressing down on them in a way that Sarah had never quite felt before. "We need to identify this family," Marcus said, already pulling out his laptop. "Find out who these people were. All of them." The metadata says this photograph came from the Harlan County collection, donated in 2016 by someone named Patricia Hartley Morrison. "Don't contact her yet," Marcus said. "Let's do some preliminary research first. If this is what it looks like, we need to approach this carefully." Sarah nodded, understanding his caution. If these women had been illegally confined, if this photograph documented abuse, they were dealing with something that went beyond historical curiosity. They were uncovering a crime, even if it had been committed more than a century ago. "Let me check the database for Hartley families in Harlan County in the 1880s and 1890s, Marcus said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. Sarah meanwhile pulled up the physical files associated with the photograph donation. Patricia Hartley Morrison had contributed not just this photograph but an entire box of family documents, letters, diary pages, property deeds, and genealogical research. Got something, Marcus said. Census records for Harlan County, 1890. There's a Thomas Hartley, age 52, listed as farmer. Living at his residence are Elizabeth Hartley, age 48, wife. 4 children, Robert, 24. Margaret, 22. James, 19. Catherine, 16. He paused, scrolling down. And here's where it gets interesting. 2 more names, listed separately, Mary Hartley, 26, and Ann Hartley, 24. Their relationship to Thomas is listed as sisters. And their occupation, Marcus's voice dropped. Their occupation is listed as insane. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Insane wasn't an occupation. It was a condition, a diagnosis, or a justification, Marcus said grimly. In the 1890s, declaring someone insane gave family members almost unlimited power over them, especially women. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the clicking of keyboards, the rustling of papers, and the rain against the windows. Sarah found herself returning again and again to the photograph, to those faces in the window. Mary and Ann Hartley, 26 and 24 years old, sisters to Thomas Hartley, who stood so confidently at the center of the family portrait. Marcus found the next piece of the puzzle in a collection of medical correspondence. Dr. William Preston of Lexington had been a prominent physician in the region. His papers included copies of letters to patients and their families. The letter was dated June 15, 1889, addressed to Thomas Hartley in Harlan County. Marcus read it aloud, his voice taking on the formal cadence of 19th century correspondence. Dear Mr. Hartley, I have examined your sisters Mary and Ann as requested during my recent visit to your property. Both exhibit symptoms consistent with melancholia and nervous excitement, conditions which I understand manifested following the typhoid epidemic of 1884. Miss Mary has shown violent tendencies, as you described, including refusal of food and attempts to leave the premises without supervision. Miss Ann suffers from episodes of confusion, disorientation, and speaking in nonsensical patterns. She does not consistently recognize family members and displays inappropriate emotional responses to normal situations. Given the severity and persistence of these symptoms, I concur with your assessment that home confinement is necessary. The state asylum at Lakeland is currently overcrowded, and conditions there are unsuitable for women of breeding and refinement. The restraints you described are, regrettably, necessary for their safety and yours, as well as for the safety of your children. I am concerned about the potential for these conditions to manifest in your offspring, as there is some evidence that such nervous disorders may run in families. I will send my recommended tinctures and medications by post. The laudanum should be administered twice daily to calm their agitations. I remain at your service should you require further consultation. Respectfully, Dr. William Preston, physician, Lexington, Kentucky. Sarah felt sick. The casual mention of restraints, the clinical description of symptoms that could have been anything from actual mental illness to depression, grief, or even physical disease misdiagnosed in an era when medical understanding was primitive at best. The suggestion that their conditions might be hereditary, which would have terrified Thomas Hartley. And the laudanum, an opium-based tincture that would have kept the women in a constant state of drugged compliance. We need to understand what happened in 1884, Sarah said. This epidemic he mentions. Marcus was already searching through newspaper archives. There was a major typhoid outbreak in eastern Kentucky in the summer of 1884. He pulled up a digitized newspaper from the Harlan County Observer, dated August 1884. The headline read, Typhoid Epidemic Claims Dozens in County. The article listed casualties, and there, in stark black and white, was the first wave of the Hartley family tragedy. Thomas Hartley of Pine Creek reports the deaths of his wife, Sarah Hartley, age 38, and 3 children, Elizabeth, age 12, Thomas Jr., age 9, and Martha, age 5. Two other members of the household, Miss Mary Hartley and Miss Anne Hartley, sisters to Mr. Hartley, have survived but remain gravely ill. Sarah did the math. Thomas Hartley had lost his wife and 3 of his children in a single summer. Mary and Anne, his younger sisters, had survived but had clearly been changed by the illness. And 6 years later, they were chained in an upstairs room while the new family posed for a portrait. "We need to know what happened between 1884 and 1890, Marcus said. How they went from surviving typhoid to being declared insane and imprisoned." As the afternoon wore into evening, Sarah and Marcus continued to dig through records. They found property deeds showing that Thomas Hartley had owned 120 acres in Harlan County. They found church records showing the family attended Pine Creek Baptist Church, where Thomas had been a deacon. Everything painted a picture of a respectable, prosperous family. But buried in the records were also hints of the truth. A complaint filed with the county sheriff in November 1888 by a neighbor, Ruth Morrison, reporting screams coming from the Hartley property. The sheriff's report was dismissive and brief. Investigated complaint. Mr. Hartley explained his sisters suffer from hereditary insanity. Examined the women. They are adequately cared for. Restraints are medically necessary. No action required. By the time Sarah and Marcus left the archives that evening, the rain had stopped, leaving behind puddles that reflected the streetlights. They stood in the parking lot, both hesitant to leave. "We have to tell their story," Sarah said finally. "We have to find out everything that happened to them and make sure it's known." Marcus nodded. "We'll start fresh tomorrow. I'll check court records. You keep working through those donated papers." As Sarah drove home through the quiet streets of Frankfurt, she couldn't stop thinking about those faces in the window. Mary and Anne Hartley, frozen in time, staring out at a family that had excluded them. For 129 years, they had been there, waiting for someone to notice them, to ask who they were, to care about their story. Now someone had noticed. And Sarah was determined that their story would finally be told. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the archives at 7, an hour before the building officially opened. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the photograph. Coffee in hand, she let herself into the basement and immediately pulled out the box of Hartley family papers. Marcus arrived at 8, carrying breakfast sandwiches and more coffee. The rain had cleared, leaving behind a crisp spring morning with sunlight streaming through the small basement windows. "I couldn't sleep," Marcus admitted. "I kept thinking about what we found yesterday." "It's because they were invisible," Sarah said. "Not completely erased, but deliberately overlooked. They were right there in the photograph, and for over a century, no one noticed them. They divided the work." Marcus would continue searching through official records while Sarah focused on the personal papers in the donation box. What Sarah found, buried beneath property deeds and bills of sale, was a revelation. A diary, or rather fragments of a diary, pages carefully preserved in acid-free folders. The handwriting was neat and feminine. The first page identified the author. "This diary belongs to Margaret Hartley, begun on my 20th birthday, January 15, 1888. Margaret, the daughter in the photograph, who would have been 22 when the picture was taken." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with dread. Margaret had been there. She had lived in that house with Mary and imprisoned upstairs. Sarah began to read, her coffee growing cold beside her. The early entries were ordinary enough. Notes about weather, visits from neighbors, church services. But by March 1888, a darker thread began to emerge. March 18, 1888. "I am troubled in my conscience and do not know what to do. Father says I must not speak of Aunt Mary and to anyone outside the family. He says their affliction is a family shame that must be kept private. But I remember them before the sickness came, before everything changed. Aunt Mary used to read to me from books of poetry. She had the most beautiful voice, gentle and expressive. Aunt could play the piano and sing like an angel. The house was full of music when she played. Now the house is full of silence, except for the sounds that come from upstairs. Mother says I must not listen to those sounds. She says it is the voice of madness and I must steel my heart against it. But how can I steel my heart against my own family?" Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Margaret's entries became more frequent and more detailed as months passed. She wrote about sneaking food to her aunts, about conversations whispered through the locked door, about her growing awareness that something was deeply wrong. June 3, 1888. I managed to speak to Aunt Mary through the door today. Father was in town, and Mother was visiting a neighbor. I took food upstairs and stayed longer than I should have. Aunt Mary pressed her face to the crack in the door. She looked so thin, so pale. She begged me to help them escape. She said they are not insane, that Father has locked them away out of shame. She said that after the typhoid, she was sad and angry about losing Sarah and the children. She said Anne was confused for a time, but that neither of them deserved this treatment. She asked me to write to Mr. Fletcher, her former fiancé. She said he would help if he knew. But I am afraid. If Father discovers I have been speaking to them, if he learns I am plotting against him, what will he do to me? Will I become the next woman locked in that room? Sarah looked up, tears in her eyes. Margaret had been terrified, caught between her conscience and her fear, between her love for her aunts and her dependence on her father. April 15, 1890. Mother insisted we take the photograph yesterday to mark Father's birthday. She hired Mr. Patterson, the traveling photographer from Lexington. It was an expensive undertaking, but Mother said we needed a proper family portrait now that Robert is courting and James will soon be of marriageable age. We must present ourselves well. She made us wear our best clothes and stand very still while Mr. Patterson arranged his camera. The process took nearly an hour. I could not help but glance up at Aunt Mary and Aunt Anne's window. I saw their faces there watching us. Anne was crying, I think, though it is hard to tell from such a distance. Mary had her hand pressed against the glass. I wondered if they understood what we were doing. If they understood that we were creating a family portrait that would not include them, that would pretend they did not exist. After the photograph, I asked Mother if they might come down for Father's birthday supper. She looked at me with such anger. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and pulled me aside where the others could not hear. She said I must never speak of them again, that it is God's will they be kept separate, that their affliction is a mark of sin in our family line. She said if I continued to show sympathy for them, people might think I carried the same taint. I could ruin my chances for marriage. I could bring shame upon the family. I do not believe this. I do not believe that illness is sin. But I am only a daughter in this house. I have no voice in such matters. I am as powerless as the women upstairs. As Sarah read through the diary, Marcus worked through official records. He found the 1880 census before the typhoid epidemic. Thomas Hartley had been married to Sarah Hartley, with 5 children listed. Also living in the household were Thomas's younger sisters, Mary and Anne, both listed as teachers. Teachers. Not insane, but educated women with a profession. He found more records. Mary Hartley had been engaged to a man named Daniel Fletcher in 1883. The engagement announcement appeared in the Harlan County Observer. Miss Mary Hartley, sister of Mr. Thomas Hartley of Pine Creek, is engaged to marry Mr. Daniel Fletcher, proprietor of Fletcher's Mercantile. Wedding planned for June 1884. The wedding never happened. By June 1884, the typhoid epidemic was raging through Harlan County. Marcus found a letter from Thomas Hartley to Dr. Preston, dated September 1884. Dear Dr. Preston, I write to request your guidance regarding my sisters, Mary and Anne. Both survived the typhoid fever that claimed my beloved wife and children, but they are much altered. Mary, who was before the illness gentle and biddable, has become irritable and melancholic. She weeps constantly and will not eat. She has broken off her engagement to Mr. Fletcher without explanation and refuses to see him when he calls. And, who was always somewhat nervous in temperament, has become worse. She forgets things, becomes confused about dates and names, and sometimes speaks to people who are not there. I am at a loss as to how to help them. Their behavior disturbs my surviving children. I fear their conditions may be catching or may worsen without proper management. What do you recommend? Post-typhoid complications, Sarah said, looking up from Margaret's diary. High fever can cause brain damage, neurological issues. In 1884, they wouldn't have known that. They would have just seen behavioral changes and called it insanity. Marcus nodded grimly. And Thomas remarried 2 years later to Elizabeth, who came from a prominent family in Lexington. They had 4 more children. But Mary and became an embarrassment. Evidence of disease in the family. Something to be hidden away. Sarah found a heartbreaking letter from Daniel Fletcher to Mary, dated July 1885. My dearest Mary, I have received your brother's letter informing me that our engagement must be dissolved. I do not understand. When I visited last month, you seemed well, only quiet and sad, which is natural after such loss. Your brother insists you are too unwell for marriage, that your mind is affected. I am at a loss. Please write to me yourself and tell me your wishes. I remain devoted to you. Daniel. There was no record of Mary ever replying. According to Thomas Hartley's correspondence, he had informed Daniel that Mary was incapable of making such decisions. By 1886, both sisters were confined to the upper room. Margaret's diary provided glimpses of their isolation. May 3, 1886. I sneak food to Aunt Mary and when Mother is not looking. They are so hungry. Mother says they must learn discipline, that their appetites are unnatural. Aunt Mary grabs my hand through the bars Father installed on their door. She begs me to help them leave. I am afraid. I do not know what to do. December 24, 1886. It is Christmas Eve. Downstairs, we have a tree and presents. Upstairs, my aunts are alone in the dark. I can hear Aunt Mary singing softly, the old hymns she used to sing in church. I wanted to bring them some of the Christmas cake, but Mother caught me on the stairs. She says I am too soft-hearted, that their affliction is contagious, that I must stay away from them or risk catching their madness. How can madness be contagious? I think the only madness in this house is how we treat them. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah reached the final entries in Margaret's diary. The last entry was dated March 1893 and was longer than most. March 15, 1893. Something happened today that gives me hope, though I am afraid to hope too much. Mr. Daniel Fletcher came to call. Not to see Father about business, as he sometimes does, but specifically asking to see me. Father was away in town, so Mother received him. I was called down to the parlor. Mr. Fletcher looked older than I remembered. He is 30 now and has never married. He asked me about Aunt Mary. He said he has never forgotten her, that he never believed she truly wished to break their engagement. He said he has heard rumors in town about 2 women being kept locked in our house. He asked me directly if it was true. I did not know what to say. I was afraid of betraying Father, afraid of what Mother would do. But Mr. Fletcher looked at me with such earnest concern. He said, Miss Margaret, I know you are in a difficult position. But if Mary is being held against her will, if she is in distress, I need to know. I never stopped caring for her. I can help if you will trust me. I started to cry. All the years of holding this secret, of being complicit in their imprisonment through my silence, came pouring out. I told him everything. About the typhoid, about the changes in Aunt Mary and about Father's decision to confine them, about the chains and the locked room and the years of isolation. I told him that I believe Aunt Mary is not truly insane, that she is melancholic and angry, but that her mind is sound. Mr. Fletcher listened without interrupting. Then he said, I am going to help them. I am going to find a way to free them. But I will need evidence. I will need to see them, to speak with them, to document their condition. Can you help me do this? I said yes. God help me, I said yes. I do not know what Father will do if he finds out. But I cannot remain silent any longer. Sarah looked up, her heart pounding. Daniel Fletcher. The fiancé who never gave up. He tried to help them. Marcus was already searching for information about Fletcher. And in 1894 he filed a lawsuit against Thomas Hartley. A lawsuit for false imprisonment and mistreatment of Mary and Hartley. The case went to trial? Sarah asked. It went to trial, and it became a major scandal in eastern Kentucky. The trial records were extensive, filling 3 large bound volumes. Marcus arranged for high-resolution scans to be delivered, a process that took 3 days. During that time, they found newspaper articles covering the scandal with sensational enthusiasm. The Harlan County Observer from October 18, 1894, devoted its entire front page to the story, "Shocking Case of False Imprisonment Revealed. Local farmer accused of keeping sisters in chains for 10 years. Daniel Fletcher brings suit on behalf of former fiancé. County in uproar over revelations." The article continued, "What began as a private matter of family disgrace has erupted into a public scandal that has divided our community and raised troubling questions about the treatment of the mentally infirm. Mr. Daniel Fletcher has brought suit in county court against Mr. Thomas Hartley, alleging that Mr. Hartley has falsely imprisoned his sisters, Miss Mary Hartley and Miss Ann Hartley, for approximately 10 years. Mr. Fletcher claims that the women have been kept in chains in a locked room, denied proper care, and prevented from any contact with the outside world. Mr. Hartley maintains that his sisters suffer from hereditary insanity and that their confinement is medically necessary. The case promises to be one of the most sensational trials in county history." When the trial transcripts arrived, Sarah and Marcus divided them up. The trial had lasted 2 weeks, from October 20th to November 3rd, 1894. Judge Robert Morrison presided, the same Judge Morrison whose wife Ruth had filed complaints about the screams from the Hartley house. Daniel Fletcher's testimony opened the trial. His lawyer, Samuel Blackwood from Lexington, led the questioning. "Mr. Fletcher, please tell the court how you came to bring this lawsuit," Blackwood asked. "I was engaged to Mary Hartley in 1883, Fletcher testified. "We were to be married in June of 1884. Mary was the kindest, most intelligent woman I had ever met. She was a teacher, respected in the community. Then the typhoid came. Mary survived, but her entire family was devastated. Thomas lost his wife and 3 children. I waited, giving Mary time to recover and grieve. But Thomas told me the engagement must be dissolved. He said Mary was too ill, that her mind was affected, that she was not fit for marriage. I accepted this at first, believing he knew best. But I asked to see Mary, to hear from her own lips that she wished to end our engagement. Thomas refused. He said it would agitate her, make her condition worse. I tried repeatedly over the next months to see her. I wrote letters that went unanswered. I came to the house and was turned away. Eventually, I began to hear rumors in town. People said they heard screaming from the Hartley house. They said Thomas kept his sisters locked up like animals. I did not want to believe it, but the rumors persisted. In 1893, I approached Miss Margaret Hartley. I asked her directly if Mary was being held prisoner. Margaret confirmed it. She told me things that made my blood run cold. Margaret arranged for me to see them secretly when the family was at church one Sunday morning. "And what did you observe when you saw Miss Mary Hartley?" Blackwood asked. Fletcher's voice broke in the transcript, and the court reporter noted, "Witness appears overcome with emotion. Brief recess granted." When he resumed, Fletcher described the scene. The room was perhaps 12 feet square. There were no furnishings except 2 thin mattresses on the floor. A bucket in the corner served as a privy. The smell was terrible. Both women were chained to the wall by their ankles. The chains were perhaps 6 feet long, allowing them to move around the room but not reach the door or windows. Mary recognized me immediately. She was much thinner than I remembered, her hair was long and unkempt, her clothing was old and worn. But her eyes were clear. She knew who I was. She spoke to me rationally and coherently. She was not insane. She was imprisoned. She told me she had been there since 1886, 8 years at that point. She said Thomas had decided they were a shameful burden, that their presence would harm his new family's reputation. She begged me to help them escape. She said she would rather die than spend another day in that room, and was in worse condition. She seemed confused about where she was. She thought it was still 1884. She did not recognize me, but she was not violent or dangerous. She was simply a woman whose mind had been damaged by illness and whose spirit had been broken by years of captivity. I promised them I would help. I went immediately to Mr. Blackwood, who specializes in cases involving the treatment of the mentally ill. Emma Carter, the servant who had cared for Mary and Anne, provided damning testimony. "I was hired by Mr. Hartley in 1891, Emma testified. "I was 17 years old and my family needed money. My mother was ill and could not work. Mr. Hartley paid good wages. Part of my job was to care for the 2 women in the upstairs room. I was given a key and told to bring them food twice a day, empty their chamber pots, and provide them with water for washing. I was told never to speak to them beyond what was necessary, never to unlock their chains, never to open the windows. Mr. Hartley said they were dangerous and unpredictable. Did you find them dangerous? Blackwood asked. No, sir. Miss Mary was desperate and sometimes angry, but she never threatened me or tried to hurt me. She begged me to help them escape or to bring them books or paper and pens so they could write letters. Miss and was usually quiet. She seemed lost in her own thoughts much of the time. Sometimes she thought I was her mother. Sometimes she did not seem to know where she was. But she was never violent. They were both very thin because they were given very little food. Mrs. Hartley said that rich foods would excite their madness, so they were to have only bread, thin soup, and water. In winter, there was no heat in the room. I sometimes brought them extra blankets from my own bed because I could not bear to see them shivering. The room was cleaned only once a week. The smell was awful. They had no privacy, no dignity, no comfort. They were treated worse than animals. Why did you not report this to the authorities? Emma's voice was barely audible. I was afraid. I needed the wages. And I thought, who would believe me? Mr. Hartley was a respected man. He had a letter from a doctor saying they were insane. I was just a poor girl with no education. When Mr. Fletcher offered to pay me to let him see Miss Mary, I agreed because I thought maybe he could help in ways I could not. I am glad I did. I should have done it sooner. Dr. William Preston was called to testify. Under cross-examination by Samuel Blackwood, his story fell apart. Dr. Preston, you provided medical justification for the confinement of Mary and Hartley. On what basis did you make your diagnosis? Blackwood asked. I examined both women in 1885, shortly after they recovered from typhoid fever, Preston replied. They exhibited symptoms of melancholia and nervous agitation. Have you examined them since 1885? I saw them briefly in 1889. Briefly? I observed them through the door of their room. Mr. Hartley did not think it advisable to enter the room, as they were in a state of agitation that day. So you diagnosed them as insane based on one examination 9 years ago and one observation through a closed door 5 years ago? I also relied on Mr. Hartley's reports of their behavior. Did you ever consider that their melancholia and agitation might be a result of their circumstances rather than a cause of them? Preston had no good answer. Mental illness is complex. It is difficult to determine cause and effect. Did you specifically recommend that Mary and be chained? I recommended appropriate restraints. Have Mary or ever harmed anyone? Mr. Hartley reported that Mary struck a servant in 1885. Once. 9 years ago. And for this single incident, you recommended chains. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. James Harrison from the State Hospital in Lexington. Judge Morrison had ordered an independent examination 2 weeks before the trial. I examined both women on October 5, 1894, Dr. Harrison testified. Mary Hartley is 30 years old. She is significantly underweight and shows signs of prolonged malnutrition. She has scars on her ankles from the restraints. Mentally, she is fully competent. She is articulate, rational, and able to answer questions appropriately. She suffers from what I would term situational melancholia, depression directly attributable to her circumstances. Her emotional distress is a reasonable response to years of imprisonment, not evidence of insanity. With proper nutrition, medical care, and freedom, I believe she would recover fully. And Hartley is 28 years old. Her physical condition is similar to Mary's. Her mental state is more complex. She does suffer from cognitive impairment, likely resulting from brain damage caused by high fever during the typhoid epidemic. She has gaps in her memory, periods of confusion, and difficulty with temporal orientation. However, in her lucid periods, she understands her situation and expresses a clear desire for freedom. Her confusion is made worse by her isolation and the monotony of her confinement. She would benefit from a structured environment with mental stimulation and social interaction. Neither woman requires restraints. Neither is dangerous. Neither has shown any tendency toward violence. In my professional opinion, these women have been criminally mistreated. Their confinement is not medically justified. It is cruel and inhumane. Thomas Hartley testified in his own defense. His testimony revealed the mixture of genuine belief, religious justification, and self-interest that had motivated his actions. "Mr. Hartley, why did you confine your sisters?" his attorney asked. "They were afflicted after the typhoid," Hartley replied. "I watched them change from the women they had been. Mary became angry and difficult, refusing to accept my authority, and became confused and inappropriate in her behavior." Dr. Preston confirmed they were suffering from insanity. "As their guardian, as the male head of the family, it was my duty to manage them. The state asylum was overcrowded and unsuitable. I had young children in the house who needed protection from their madness." Under cross-examination by Samuel Blackwood, Hartley's justifications began to crumble. "Mr. Hartley, you remarried in 1886. Did your new wife express concern about how the presence of your sisters might affect her social standing in the community?" Hartley was silent for a long moment. "She was concerned, yes. She came from a good family in Lexington. She was concerned about how association with insanity might affect our children's prospects. So she wanted them hidden away. She wanted them managed appropriately." The photograph taken in 1890. "Why were Mary and Anne visible in the window? I did not notice they were there until after the photograph was developed." "You stood in front of your house for nearly an hour while the photographer set up his equipment, and you did not once look up at the window where your sisters were imprisoned?" I did not think of it." Or perhaps you thought of it so little, they mattered so little, that their presence simply did not register as important? No answer. "Mr. Hartley, do you love your sisters?" "I do my Christian duty toward them." "That is not what I asked. Do you love them?" "They are afflicted. It is God's judgment upon our family for sins I do not fully understand. I have protected my own children from this taint." The verdict came on November 3, 1894. Judge Morrison ruled that Mary and Anne Hartley were not legally insane and had been falsely imprisoned. He ordered their immediate release from Thomas Hartley's custody and awarded damages of $5,000 to be split between them. Thomas Hartley was also ordered to pay all court costs and attorney fees. In his ruling, Judge Morrison made a statement that was quoted in full in the newspaper. "This court has heard evidence of cruelty that shames us all. 2 women guilty of no crime, afflicted by illness through no fault of their own, were imprisoned in chains for nearly a decade by the very person who should have protected them. We have heard how they were denied food, warmth, dignity, and any semblance of human kindness." The defense argues that Mr. Hartley acted within his legal rights as guardian. But there are rights that supersede legal technicalities. No person, no matter how afflicted, deserves to be treated as these women were treated. No diagnosis justifies such cruelty. They are hereby released from his custody, and he is ordered to provide compensation for their suffering. Let this case serve as a warning that the law will not tolerate such treatment of our most vulnerable citizens. The scandal destroyed Thomas Hartley socially and financially. Within 6 months, he had sold his farm and moved with his wife and children to Ohio, where they lived in obscurity. Margaret Hartley, who had testified at the trial, was ostracized by her mother but supported by a community that saw her as a hero for speaking truth. But what happened to Mary and Anne? Sarah found the answer in the records of the Women's Relief Society of Lexington, a charitable organization that provided housing for indigent women. Mary and Anne had been placed there after the trial. The intake forms described their condition. Mary was thin, weak, but mentally sound. Requires medical attention for malnutrition and injuries. Articulate and eager to rebuild her life. Anne was physically weak with significant mental confusion. Requires ongoing medical supervision. Gentle temperament. Responds positively to kindness. Over the next months, the Relief Society documented Mary's recovery. She gained weight. Her injuries healed. She began to help around the facility. By 1896, she was working as a teacher in Lexington, living independently in a boarding house for working women. In Mary's personal papers, Sarah found a letter Mary had written to Daniel Fletcher in January 1895, declining his marriage proposal. "Dear Daniel, your proposal honors me and moves me more than I can express. Your loyalty and courage saved my life. I will be forever grateful. But I cannot marry you. The woman you loved in 1883 no longer exists. 10 years in that room changed me in ways I am still discovering. I am angry in ways I do not fully understand. I am frightened of confinement, even the ordinary constraints of marriage and domestic life. I need time to discover who I am now, free for the first time in a decade. I need to prove to myself that I can survive and thrive on my own. You deserve a wife who comes to you whole and hopeful, not broken and wary. Please understand that this decision reflects my damage, not any lack of feeling for you. You will always hold a place of honor in my heart. But I must walk my own path now. I hope you will find happiness with someone who can give you the life you deserve. Yours in friendship and gratitude, Mary." Fletcher never married. According to city directories and census records, he remained in Harlan County, running his mercantile and serving on civic committees. He died in 1927, unmarried, age 64. Anne's story was more tragic. The years of imprisonment had taken a greater toll on her already fragile mental state. She remained at the Relief Society facility for the rest of her life. The records showed that she had good days and bad days. On good days, she helped with simple tasks, sang hymns, seemed to understand where she was. On bad days, she was confused, frightened, calling for her mother, asking when she could go home. The staff described her as sweet-tempered and childlike, never violent, just lost, and died on February 12, 1902, of pneumonia. She was 38 years old. The Relief Society gave her a proper burial in their section of Lexington Cemetery. Mary lived until 1923, dying at age 61. She had taught school for over 20 years, eventually becoming headmistress of a small academy for girls. She never married but had close friendships with other independent women. She became involved in women's rights advocacy and in efforts to reform the treatment of the mentally ill in Kentucky. In 1920, Mary testified before a state legislative committee considering reforms to commitment laws. Sarah found a transcript of her testimony. "I am here to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves," Mary had said. "I was imprisoned for 10 years based on one doctor's diagnosis and my brother's word. I had no right to appeal. I had no right to a hearing. I had no right even to be heard. If not for the courage of a man who never forgot me, I would have died in that room. I am one of the lucky ones. How many others are locked away in attics and back rooms across Kentucky, declared insane by family members who find them inconvenient or embarrassing? How many are restrained and drugged into submission? How many will die without anyone knowing their names? I am asking this committee to pass laws requiring independent medical evaluation before anyone can be confined. I am asking for regular inspections. I am asking for the right of the accused to be heard, to have an advocate. These are modest requests. They should not be controversial, but they could save lives." Kentucky passed some reforms in 1921, though not as comprehensive as Mary had requested. It was a small step, but it was something. Mary Hartley died on June 15, 1923, at age 61. She died in her sleep in her small apartment in Lexington, surrounded by books and papers, having lived a life of purpose and meaning for the 29 years since her release. But Mary had left one final testimony, a journal that she had kept in her later years. Sarah found one entry particularly powerful, dated March 15, 1920, exactly 30 years after the family photograph was taken. "I am an old woman now. I have had a good life these past 25 years. I taught hundreds of children to read and write. I have friends who value me. I live where I choose and do what I please. These are simple freedoms that most people take for granted. I never will. But I still dream of that room. I still feel the weight of the chains on my ankles. I still hear Anne's voice in the darkness, asking where we are, asking when Mother is coming home. I still see Thomas's face through the locked door, cold and implacable, convinced he was doing God's will. And is gone now. The damage done to her was irreparable. She never fully came back to us after those years. She died young and confused, robbed of the life she should have had. My brother is dead now too. He died in Ohio, unknown and unremarked. I felt nothing when I heard the news. Neither satisfaction nor forgiveness. Just a vast emptiness where family feeling should have been. He took 10 years of my life and all of Anne's sanity, and he did it out of shame. Out of fear of what people would think. In the photograph he had taken in 1890, we were erased from the family, visible only as ghosts in an upper window. But we were real. We existed. We suffered. And now I write this so that someone, someday, will know we were there. Will know what was done to us. Will remember that behind the respectable facades of Victorian families, terrible things could happen. Will understand that silence is complicity. That looking away is participation. That we must bear witness to suffering. And I were there. We existed. We mattered. Do not forget us. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a lecture hall at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. It was October 20, 2019, exactly 125 years to the day since the trial of Thomas Hartley had begun. The lecture hall was packed. Word of Sarah and Marcus's research had spread through academic circles and into mainstream media. The photograph had gone viral on social media, shared millions of times with captions like, "Look at the upper window," and "The hidden women history forgot." National news outlets had picked up the story. The enlarged photograph was projected on the screen behind Sarah, Mary and Anne's faces clearly visible in the upper window. At the front sat Marcus Chin, who had co-authored their paper. Beside him sat Patricia Hartley Morrison, the descendant who had donated the family papers, who had been horrified to learn the truth but had agreed to support the research. Sarah began her presentation. History is full of invisible people. People who were there, who lived and breathed and suffered and hoped, but who were erased from the official records, from the family photographs, from the narratives we tell about the past. Or rather, not completely erased, but rendered nearly invisible, easily overlooked. Mary, Anne, and Hartley were meant to be invisible. They were locked away, declared insane, removed from the family narrative. But they weren't completely erased. They were there, in that window, and once we knew to look for them, their story emerged from a century of silence. She clicked through slides showing Margaret's diary, Emma Carter's testimony, Dr. Harrison's medical evaluation. This research has taught us several important things about the treatment of mental illness in 19th century America, about family dynamics and power structures, and about the mechanisms by which people can be disappeared even while remaining physically present. Sarah walked through the findings methodically. The typhoid epidemic of 1884. The deaths. The changes in Mary and Anne's behavior that Thomas interpreted as insanity. Dr. Preston's diagnoses based on limited examination. The decision to confine them. The chains, the minimal food, the isolation, the years of imprisonment. The secret kept by the family and tolerated by the community. Daniel Fletcher's intervention. The trial. The verdict. And finally, their lives after freedom. This story raises disturbing questions about how we treat vulnerable people, Sarah continued. In 1884, Mary and Anne survived a devastating disease only to be declared insane because they exhibited symptoms of trauma and grief. Medical diagnosis was often a tool of social control. Declaring someone insane gave family members absolute power over them, especially women. Mary and Anne had no legal rights. They couldn't appeal. They were completely at the mercy of their brother, who believed, genuinely believed, that he was doing the right thing. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Thomas Hartley wasn't a monster. He was an ordinary man, a farmer, a church deacon, someone his neighbors respected. But he was shaped by beliefs about mental illness as God's judgment, about family shame, about the importance of appearances. He convinced himself that locking his sisters away was an act of duty. He never saw it as cruelty because he never saw them as fully human anymore. Sarah showed excerpts from Mary's later writings, her testimony to the legislature, her journal entries. Mary Hartley survived. She not only survived, she thrived in many ways. She became a teacher, an advocate, a voice for those who had no voice. But she never forgot. And she made us promise, across the gulf of time, not to forget her or her sister. During the question and answer session, hands shot up across the room. A psychology professor asked about the accuracy of the diagnoses. Marcus answered that Mary likely suffered from depression or PTSD, completely treatable with proper care, and had apparently suffered neurological damage from typhoid, but even she would not have required restraints. A journalist asked about the response from Hartley family descendants. Patricia Hartley Morrison stood to speak. "I am descended from Robert Hartley, Thomas's eldest son," Patricia said. "I grew up hearing family stories about how we had moved from Kentucky to Ohio for better opportunities. I knew nothing about Mary and until Dr. Mitchell contacted me. Learning the truth has been painful and shameful. But I'm glad the truth is coming out. Every family has secrets, but some secrets deserve to be exposed. I've spent my career as a social worker helping people with disabilities live independent lives in the community. I suppose I've been atoning for my ancestors' sins without knowing it. I've also established a scholarship fund in Mary and Ann's names at the University of Kentucky for students studying mental health care and advocacy. It's a small thing, but it's something." The audience applauded as Patricia sat down, and Sarah saw several people in tears. After the lecture, dozens of people approached Sarah with their own family stories. History, Sarah realized, was full of these erasures. Every family had stories of people who had been hidden away, institutionalized, or edited out of the family narrative. In the weeks after the lecture, Sarah and Marcus published their article in the Journal of Southern History. Invisible in Plain Sight, The Hartley Sisters and Domestic Confinement in 19th Century Kentucky became one of the most read articles in the journal's history. But the response that moved Sarah most came in a letter from Jennifer Hartley, a descendant who worked as a social worker in Cincinnati. "Dear Dr. Mitchell, I read your article with great interest and great shame. I am descended from the Hartley family. Robert Hartley was my great-great-grandfather. I knew nothing about Mary and Ann. I work with people with mental illness, helping them live independent lives. I suppose I am trying to atone for what my ancestor did, though I didn't know I was doing it until now. I have something to send you. My grandmother left me a box of family papers. In it, I found a letter from Margaret Hartley, written in 1930, shortly before her death. I think you should have it." Margaret was Thomas's daughter, the one who testified at the trial. This letter was written to her own daughter, and it has been passed down through the women in our family. I never understood its significance until I read your article. I am sending you the original. Thank you for giving voice to Mary and Ann. The letter Margaret had written was addressed to her daughter, Catherine. Sarah read it with tears streaming down her face. "My dear Catherine," Margaret had written in shaky handwriting. "I am an old woman now, 72 years old, and soon I will be gone. Before I die, I must tell you the truth about our family. When I was young, I was a coward. I watched my aunts suffer and did nothing beyond small acts of kindness that could not save them. I did not speak out until it was almost too late. I accepted my mother's cruel explanation that their affliction was God's will. I was silent when silence was complicity. When Mr. Fletcher approached me in 1893 and asked if the rumors were true, I finally found courage. I helped him see Aunt Mary and Aunt Ann. I testified at the trial. And for this, my mother never forgave me. She told me I had betrayed the family. But I know now that the shame was not in speaking truth. The shame was in the silence, in the years of looking away. Your grandfather encouraged me to speak publicly, to testify for mental health reform when Aunt Mary was advocating for new laws in the 1920s. But I was afraid. Afraid of scandal, afraid of being associated with insanity. I took the coward's path. I remained silent after the trial. Aunt Mary fought alone for reforms while I stayed quiet. Now, at the end of my life, this is my deepest regret. Not the things I did, but the things I failed to do. The courage I lacked. The voice I did not raise. If you learn nothing else from my life, learn this. Silence in the face of injustice is itself an injustice. Speak up, even when it is difficult, even when it costs you something. Do not let others be erased, made invisible, forgotten. Bear witness. Tell the truth. Be willing to be uncomfortable, to be unpopular, if that is what it takes to do what is right. I failed in this. I hope you will do better. This is my final instruction to you, my daughter. Do better than I did. And do not forget Mary and Anne. Remember them. Honor them. Make sure their suffering was not meaningless. With love and regret, your mother, Margaret. Sarah framed a copy and hung it above her desk in the archives. On difficult days, she would read Margaret's words and remember why historical research mattered. 3 months later, in March 2020, Sarah spoke at a conference at the Old State Asylum in Lakeland, Kentucky, now converted into a museum about mental health history. The asylum buildings were imposing structures of red brick. Inside, the museum had created a new exhibit titled The Unseen: Domestic Confinement and Family Secrets. The enlarged Hartley photograph was the centerpiece, with displays about Mary and Anne's lives, their confinement, their freedom, and their legacies. At the end of the exhibit was a wall where visitors could leave reflections. Sarah stood reading the notes. I had a relative who was hidden away in the 1950s. Thank you for making this visible. My daughter has bipolar disorder. I'm grateful we live in a time when she can get treatment instead of chains. We must never forget. During her conference presentation, Sarah showed the photograph one more time. When I first saw Mary and Anne in that window, I saw ghosts. Faint images of people who had been forgotten. But they weren't ghosts. They were real women with real lives that were stolen from them. And they left traces. Traces in documents, in photographs, in the memories of people who knew them. Our job as historians is to find those traces and to reconstruct the stories that others tried to erase. Not to judge the past by present standards, but to understand it fully, in all its complexity and cruelty and occasional mercy. Thomas Hartley believed he was doing the right thing. Margaret Hartley knew it was wrong but felt powerless. Daniel Fletcher risked his reputation to help. Every person in this story made choices, and those choices had consequences that echoed through generations. We study history not just to document what happened but to understand why it happened, how it was allowed to happen. Because if we understand that, maybe we can recognize similar dynamics in our own time. Maybe we can intervene earlier. Mary, Anne, and Hartley were meant to be invisible. But they weren't. They were there. They existed. They mattered. And now, more than a century later, their story is finally being told. Not just told, but heard. Not just heard, but remembered. Not just remembered, but honored. That evening, Sarah and Marcus drove to the old Hartley farm property in Harlan County. With permission from the current owners, who lived in a modern ranch-style home built after the original farmhouse had burned down, they placed a historical marker near the road. The brass plaque, commissioned by the Kentucky Historical Society with funding from Patricia Hartley Morrison and Jennifer Hartley, read, "On this land once stood the home of Mary Hartley, 1864 to 1923, Anne and Hartley, 1866 to 1902. Following the typhoid epidemic of 1884, these women were confined to an upstairs room of their brother's farmhouse for nearly 10 years, chained and isolated from the community. In 1894, a lawsuit brought by Daniel Fletcher exposed their treatment and secured their freedom. Mary Hartley went on to become a teacher and advocate for mental health reform. And Hartley never fully recovered from the trauma of her confinement and died at age 38. Their story reminds us that the most vulnerable members of society require protection, that family privacy cannot justify cruelty, and that speaking truth to power requires courage. They were here. They mattered. They are remembered. Erected 2020 by the Kentucky Historical Society. As the sun set over the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows across the landscape, Sarah stood looking at the plaque and thought about the photograph that had started everything. Mary and Anne in the window, their faces pressed against the glass, watching a family pose for a portrait that was meant to exclude them. But they had insisted on being visible, on being in the frame, on leaving evidence of their existence. And more than a century later, someone had finally noticed. Marcus stood beside her, equally quiet. Finally, he said, "When we started this research, I thought we were just documenting a historical case of abuse. But it's become something more. It's become a meditation on visibility and invisibility, on who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. And on the responsibility we have, Sarah added, those of us who have the tools to bring those stories to light. We can't save Mary and Anne. We can't undo what was done to them, but we can make sure they're not forgotten. We can make sure their suffering has meaning. They stood there until the sun had fully set and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Then they drove back to Lexington, through the mountain roads, past small towns where lights were coming on in windows. Back in Frankfort, in the basement archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, thousands of photographs still waited in filing cabinets and storage boxes. Images of families and communities, of celebrations and tragedies, of lives lived in the past. And in how many of those photographs were there faces in windows, figures in doorways, people at the edges who had been overlooked, forgotten, erased? Sarah didn't know the answer to that question, but she knew she would spend the rest of her career trying to find out. One photograph at a time. One enlarged image at a time. One face in the window at a time. Because everyone deserved to be seen. Everyone deserved to be remembered. Everyone deserved to have their story told. Even the people who were meant to be invisible. Especially the people who were meant to be invisible. As Sarah worked late into the night, cataloging more photographs, enhancing more images, searching for more hidden stories, she thought about Mary Hartley's journal entry. I write this so that someone, someday, will know we were there. That someone was Sarah. That someday was now. And Mary and Anne's story was finally, fully, permanently told. Not hidden in a locked room, not erased from a family portrait, not forgotten by history, but visible, acknowledged, remembered. They were there. They existed. They mattered. And they would never be invisible again.